For as much as I struggle to like this manga adaptation, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, the Persona 3 manga became better in the second half, which somewhat lines up with a 2.5-year break during the time he worked on the Persona 4 manga. I can't speak on the Persona 4 manga, I haven't read it yet, but perhaps it's better than this adaptation. Maybe I'll find out one day. That's how I capped off my analytical breakdown of why the manga adaptation of Persona 3 was not good. A cautious but hopeful send-off to a manga I felt deeply conflicted over. Rampant issues plague the manga, yet I hope that it could be rectified in the sequel. After not liking most of Tsuji Sogabe's creative decisions during his last foray into the Persona series, I opened the first volume of Persona 4 knowing it very well could be a repeat of what happened before. 13 volumes later, and my cautious optimism was rewarded by a great reading experience. I am overjoyed that I went into this adaptation with an open mind, because some liberties Sogabe took are totally welcomed by me. That's not to say he perfectly retold the story, but he did greatly improve upon his disastrous adaptation of Persona 3. Shockingly, he even managed to take steps towards correcting some of my personal grievances with the game, as controversial as that might sound. Let's not put the cart before the horse though. Persona 4 is a wonderful game despite its flaws. In the most flattering sense, it is non-offensive. It has solid gameplay, likable characters, and a good story to get invested into. It isn't my favorite of the series, but I appreciate what it has to offer. In contrast to Persona 3's somber, contemplative look into mortality, or the depressive moodiness of Persona 5's social injustice, Persona 4 is bright and, for a lack of a better word, fun. The color palette is warm with a joyful yellow permeating every corner of the game's aesthetic. It's hard to ruminate on the story's sinister happenings when the game's tone is so poppy. The most intrinsic part of the experience might be the cozy world building of Inaba, which is welcoming and its locals are just as inviting. Anyone could come to this town and find a place to belong. It's far too hospitable to feel alone. It doesn't take long for the protagonist to find himself at the center of a friend group, and his extended family quickly bring him into their home with open arms. He is thrust into a countryside world that is more than willing to accept him as one of their own. It's ironic then that the game's core message explores the true essence of a person's repressed self versus the pressures of society's expectations of who they should be. While Inaba is a quaint little town, it has the ability to bring out the worst in people. Rumors, gossip, and unfair judgment. This town has its own set of problems to contend with. Yet the people that fill it are oh so lovable. The members of the investigation team are perhaps the biggest oddballs in town, sometimes enough so that they are ostracized, but they are good-natured people. Persona 4's cast has a flavor profile that is distinct from the others, mostly because the character synergy has a sticky quality. They're a hilarious group of misfits that always seem to get themselves into trouble. The dynamic of the investigation team is significantly different from Persona 3's Siege, where in that game the characters are pulled together by external forces and hardly by choice. That group is often at odds with itself, many of the members struggling to perfectly fit in place. It's a bit of a stretch to even call them friends, at least for a sizable portion of the story, considering how many tense relationships are tugging at the corners. Their dynamic is also structured in a near hierarchy, where the upperclassmen have the final say in most situations, minus the protagonist's leadership in battle. Even then, while he can call some shots, he still has to respect their status. In contrast, the investigation team is a group of second and first years. While there's a level of respect for the second years, the team operates on mostly equal footing. It's easy to be taken in by the endearing friendships that hold together the investigation team. As each one is inducted into the party, the bonds of the team grow deeper and they prove to be capable of helping each other come to terms with who they are. A great deal of fans will find themselves drawn into their identity complexes and find solace in the friend group's warmth. Many will also enjoy the life sim elements that were introduced in Persona 3 and further developed in 4. The calendar system gives the player the freedom to make choices each day, from who they want to hang out with to what stats they want to raise. While the last game had a handful of memorable events, Persona 4, specifically Golden, added a ton of special events to fill that calendar. Multiple school trips, beauty pageants, riding scooters to the beach, hot springs, an idol concert. There's a ton going on throughout the year. Rarely is there ever more than a couple weeks of free time without something happening. However, in those moments of freedom, social links will take up a majority of that time, and on paper, it's a pretty clever way to get the player attached to the game. This ensures that players are enjoying their time in Inaba with its inhabitants. By being allowed to pick and choose which characters you want to see further developed, or simply which ones you like enough to spend your limited time with, a personal experience is created. Each one has something new to add to the overall experience. It just depends on who you think is worth including in that list. Although Persona 4 is a landmark JRPG, one that opened the door for many newcomers into both the series and genre it came from, it took some questionable steps, not quite forward or backwards, but it definitely sidestepped. It adopted new priorities, ones that suggested a stronger importance on social links and less emphasis on story-driven character writing. Rather than long-term development where a character changes under the pressures the story asserts onto them throughout the entire game, Persona 4 operates in a condensed method. Typically, a character will follow the structure of being introduced under the pretense of being a potential victim. They are kidnapped and sent into the other world, the team helps them face their other selves, and they are inducted into the investigation team as a member. This time frame spans about a month's worth of in-game days, and once it comes to a conclusion, the cycle brings a new character into focus while the previous one becomes open for a social link. Their development is now limited to that in-game month and their social links, which have effectively replaced their long-term involvement in the story's direction. Previously in Persona 3, the female party members also had social links, but there's a distinct difference. Their social links were about their relationship with the protagonist, not their conflict within the main story, whereas each of the investigation team's social links are follow-ups to their time spent within the TV world and the revelations they made about themselves. Within their social links are the conclusions to their character arcs and the upgrades to their ultimate personas, spawned by the newfound resolution in their heart. Social links are also now made available for all party members, and they're always opened up soon after being added to the team. Because the story and social links are independent scripts, with the exception of Teddy, the change within one must not contradict the other. One is an optional way of developing a character, but it must remain consistent with the main story, or maybe more applicable, the story cannot change the character in a way that isn't reflected in the social link. Because the character must align in both, only one can be allowed to drastically change them. Persona 4 chose to focus on social links for the method of extended character growth. On one hand, this works perfectly fine for this specific iteration, which is more laid back and centered around the friendships of the main characters. In the context of its lower dosage of melodrama, it makes sense that the characters' arcs are defined by tender, personal exchanges with the protagonist, rather than big, explosive moments of tragedy. On the other hand, regardless of why, almost the entire cast feels stagnant when the story is moving forward. For instance, Yosuke is only granted meaningful change in two situations: the early hours of the game that surround Saki's death, and optionally, when the player chooses to interact with him for his social link. It gives more importance to the protagonist's relationship with him, but it restrains the story from having influence in that growth. This method of writing prioritizes the intimate bonds between player and character, and I don't think it's correct to say that this is a step backwards. That would imply it's inherently worse. Although I do find myself genuinely wishing that this wasn't the direction the series took. In my video about Persona 3's manga, I talked more at length about why I prefer the structure of 3's character writing and why, in that context, I'm not the biggest fan of 4's. Unfortunately, the days of any character being allowed to grow independently of the protagonist throughout the story have been left behind. Opening the first pages of Persona 4's manga adaptation, I didn't entirely know what to expect, but I certainly didn't expect for this issue to be addressed to any extent. Yet it made one of my favorite changes in any adaptation ever. I mentioned Yosuke before because I always felt his story had a lot of potential that was unfairly cut short. His social link is satisfying enough, but the drama of his inner conflict between Saki's death and using it as an excuse for self-serving adventure is the most interesting his character ever was. The manga made the bold decision to swap out the protagonist with Yosuke in the social link with Saki's brother, Naoki, and this is huge for a couple reasons. For one, it only made sense that Yosuke should have a relationship with Naoki. He was the one who had a romantic interest in Saki, and the one who had an emotional crisis over his true thoughts about her death, not the protagonist. Of course, he would reach out to Naoki and attempt to make friends with him. That empathy could only come from Yosuke. Additionally, their differences as the son of a Junes manager and the son of a local business gives more weight to Naoki's plight. He can't help but kind of resent Junes, and yet, through his growing friendship with Yosuke, he comes to understand why the people of Inaba value its business. For 2, building a bond between Yosuke and Naoki is a way for both of them to come to terms with Saki's death. They are the only 2 characters deeply affected by it, after all. It's comforting to find someone who can relate with your struggles one way or another, and it allows Yosuke to have a far more emotionally cathartic resolution to his conflict, compared to Naoki having his big moment while the protagonist just kinda stands there, which is typical for Persona. Yosuke and Naoki are finally able to come to terms together. Their emotional heart-to-heart is touching in a way that I don't believe could have been possible if adapted in the more obvious way. I like Naoki's social link a ton, but the protagonist doesn't do much for his story. He's kind of an emotional sponge. What makes Naoki's social link special has nothing to do with who the protagonist is. Somehow, using Naoki's scenes as a basis for the manga's version, but with Yosuke, works better than expected. He fits right into the moment, and in a way, it's hard to imagine these 2 characters never being allowed to share in their mourning of Saki to this degree. For 3, Naoki strengthens Yosuke's resolve to bring the murderer to justice. They become friends right before the team faces down the accused murderer, Mitsuo, driving Yosuke to feel more motivated than ever before. Rather than obtaining his ultimate persona during a social link, his newfound resolve changes his soul for the better during the battle. In the game, the player simply beats a boss fight with any given 4 characters. Yosuke is not important here, and Naoki certainly isn't. The manga's change in direction means this massive story event is brought to an end by Yosuke's growth as a character. He has changed because of the Konishi siblings this far into the story, much further than in the game, in a way that ties them into the overarching narrative, rather than being an optional social link or character limited to the prologue. Saki's death is given more relevance, and Naoki's suffering is now turned into a fundamental part of Yosuke's growth. This creative liberty pulls the narrative strings tighter than it ever was before. It gives them a longer lasting impact in the story and gives Yosuke a moment to shine, something he was severely lacking by this point in the game. I almost think it's worth losing out on his social link for this moment alone. The choice to change out the protagonist for Yosuke during Naoki's social link was beyond genius, and it honestly takes a step towards solving one of my biggest gripes with the game. I only say a step because this is admittedly the exception, not the rule. It remains true that the other characters are also reborn, reaching their ultimate personas during major story events, but none of them are as cohesive of an addition as Yosuke's. Kanji is almost worth talking about. It's cool that his persona changes during the confrontation with Shadow Naoto. He is the only character who could possibly have that kind of connection with Naoto, enough so to find new resolve, although his moment is understated by comparison because it lacks sufficient build-up, at least in the sense that their emotional connection is limited to only a handful of interactions. Still, I appreciate the thought that Kanji might be willing to find a stronger resolve by seeing another victim of self-identity and gender norms. There's an idea there that could be worked into a truly special moment worthy of his new resolve and persona. Teddy's social link was scripted within the game, which I kinda prefer for a party member, and his resolution of heart is a tad different, but it functionally works the same. By a sliver, I might prefer the manga's interpretation, as he uses it as a final push to find Adachi, but either version works for his character. The scenes for Chie, Yukiko, Rise, and Naoto's resolution of hearts are less impressive than the previously mentioned, however. Generally, their big moment only goes as far as finding resolution to save another person or to beat their enemy. None of them involve a complex emotional connection to another character or a major event that fundamentally changes them. Their ultimate personas are nothing more than power-ups rather than representations of how they've changed as people. I'd be lying if I didn't say I was a tad disappointed after the promise Yosuke showed, although it's perfectly understandable why the remaining characters would be difficult to give as good of treatment. Yosuke had an opening, an element of the main storyline that could be expanded upon, and Naoki whom he could connect with, and the others simply do not have that privilege. These characters were written in such a way that removes their arcs from the rest of the game. Without being flexible, without adding or majorly changing story events, there's not many opportunities to expand more on them. Chie, for example, had a fairly simple complex over Yukiko during the early stages of the story. She believed that despite not being as good as her friend, she could take advantage of her. After resolving her personal demons, she joins the team to save Yukiko. From there, where exactly is her arc supposed to go, and how could it possibly tie into anything else? What can the currently existing story do to further her as a character? Perhaps an original scenario could be made where Yukiko needs Chie to save her, and this time out of a selfless desire to protect her friend, she could find a new resolve, but frankly, there's no room for that in any major conflict. Every boss fight in the game is story heavy, and usually the spotlight is already on another character. To make a scenario like that occur, filler would likely have to be added. There's only two reasons this change worked for Yosuke. Saki's death was relevant to the battle, and Mitsuo's dungeon does not see a new member of the investigation team join. Unless a wholly original threat was created, there aren't many ways the central conflict could uprise a new, deeply personal change within the remaining characters. They were never made to be developed in that way, which could only be worked with so much. It was worthwhile to attempt a different method of completing their character arcs, however, if only because I never could get entirely behind the game structure. While this all means social links take a bit of a hit in relevance, I don't mind how they're implemented. Instead of being optional content outside of the main story, bits and pieces of a character's social link are used before and after their climactic battle, and to a lesser extent throughout the story. Typically, a character's backstory will be revealed before they accept their shadow as a part of themselves, and this allows for them to be better understood, especially as it sheds some light on why they came to be who they are. In the game, the player can only ever see a character's personal struggles through the lens of the protagonist. Even if that information can be delivered to us through dialogue, it's far more interesting if that drama is communicated directly. Chie and Yukiko share a backstory, one that is only expressed through Chie opening up to the protagonist in the game. The manga went the extra mile to show how it happened, and in the moments leading up to the fight against Shadow Yukiko, it's quite good at setting the stage for their confrontation. Rise's backstory works really well in building a better understanding of her status as an idol and the damage it did to her personal life. She feels more human than ever in this scene, and despite the same story being told in the game, it has so much more impact when her experience is visibly shown. Naoto's backstory is decent, but I can't say it's quite as strong as the others. It's a mere 2 pages, and it could have used a bit more. Kanji has possibly my favorite backstory, which shows how the praise he once received for being talented at arts and crafts slowly turned into disgust from his peers. He wasn't ignored, he was outright bullied for his interest. He was truly a sweet child and quite cute, all the more sad that he felt the need to put up such a masculine facade. By taking inspiration from the original social links and repurposing them in this way, the drama is greatly benefited. Giving the other team members small backstories before their big climax goes a long way in establishing the root of their emotional turmoil. On occasion, the protagonist has a heart-to-heart moment with the newly added party member, which is typically adapting a notable moment from their social link. Although these scenes are less frequent than their backstories, they serve as a reward for the character being able to accept who they are. It might seem as if these scenes would be rushed and come too soon after the character faces themselves, but they work their way into the moment almost seamlessly. It would be preferable to have more scenes between the protagonist and each team member, sure, but this is an adequate way to present the best moments of their social links. Some fans of the game might feel as though it's off-putting to have Yosuke's max rank event within the first volume, but A, this moment doesn't serve the same purpose now that social links aren't the method of ultimate personas, and B, it works just fine within a vacuum separate from how the game does it. In contrast to Persona 3, which had a high quantity of scenes without the protagonist present, you would be pressed to find scenes without the protagonist in Persona 4. He is not only a lens to see Inaba from, he is a box that the player is trapped inside for an overwhelming majority of the game's story. There's an exceedingly low number of instances where relationships independent of the protagonist are seen, and no character is allowed to have a subplot without the protagonist right by their side. It's not that everything revolves around the protagonist, it's that we aren't allowed to see anything but the protagonist's point of view. Despite how good the character cast is, they are entirely limited to their overlapping time with the protagonist. Everything I've addressed about the manga thus far, the adjustments to the ultimate personas, and reworking of social links, leads to one train of thought. The importance of the protagonist has been scaled down. Soji Seta, as he's known in the manga, is not the center of the world or lives of his friends. The manga more frequently breaks away from Soji to see the story from the perspectives of the other characters, if only briefly, and that does wonders to give these characters their own leg to stand on. The other characters even narrate parts of their story arcs. For a moment they are allowed to share their inner thoughts and feelings directly to the reader, and not just through dialogue with the protagonist. Not every moment of their development has to center around him, and their stories can be seen from their perspective. For the first time in Persona 4, the characters are allowed to exist without the protagonist. I don't hate social links, and certainly don't think having an active protagonist is an issue, but Persona 4 kinda overkilled it. The manga could only do so much in giving these characters freedom without upending the entire story, but allowing them to at least exist independently of the protagonist is greatly appreciated. It's not as if Soji can't converse with the team or have a meaningful moment with them, but now they are not limited to his influence. One would be forgiven for thinking this meant Soji has no character, but that isn't the case. While the manga is less protagonist-centered, Soji has a better story than ever before. Beyond old silent films, which were designed to express character through methods other than dialogue, most stories don't want a protagonist that can't speak for themselves. It only works in video games because the player is intended to see themselves as the protagonist. When adapting a video game into another form of media, silent protagonists are possibly the most challenging aspect to get right. How much original personality should they receive? Should they be reinterpreted into a different character? Is it best to avoid this kind of situation at all? Persona's adaptations have gone about solving this issue in different ways, yet I don't think many have nailed it. The closest to a satisfying interpretation was Persona 4 the Animation's version of Yu Narukami. He was aloof in some ways, but the anime often poked fun at him. If there were a correct way to adapt his character, it's tempting to say this is the safest bet. Yet, the manga challenges that notion. In the game, the protagonist is introduced as a transfer student moving to Inaba for the next year while his parents work overseas. He stays with his uncle Dojima and little cousin Nanako. That is the beginning and end of his character arc. That is to say, he has next to none. It's merely an excuse, a simple premise to place him at the beginning of the story. This was never a major issue because, as stated before, the purpose of his character is to serve as a self-insert, someone brand new to Inaba just like the player. The manga takes a simple introduction and makes a new, beautiful message out of Soji's character and connects it to the overarching messages of Persona 4. Soji has more backstory than ever before, and it fleshes him out as a character that can work as more than just a projection of whoever is playing the game. As a child, he shows a deep resentment towards his parents, who were always moving for work and never managed to be there for him. This is the most pivotal change in the entire manga because it gives Soji a way to empathize with Nanako. She is a mature girl for her age, but she repeatedly finds herself feeling alone and desperate for her father's attention. There's a question of whether he even loves her, she thinks. Of course, as an adult busy with a hectic job, Dojima can only afford so much time to be with her, but she can't understand that without assuming it means he loves his job more than her. When Soji comes into their home, Nanako finally has a comforting figure in her life that can consistently be there for her, someone who can understand the loneliness of waiting for a parent to come home. They had a great dynamic already, but this extra layer makes their relationship more holistic, especially because it ties into the central conflict of Persona 4. Adachi is a villain to the bitter end, nothing can change that, yet because Soji was alone for so many years, he can understand Adachi's loneliness and sympathize with the struggle of finding somewhere to belong. The only difference being that Soji found his place in the comfort of his family and friends he met in Inaba. The two, even having the same power, are only divided by the people who stand by them. They're not all that different at the end of the day. Soji entered the story being resentful of his parents. He had never had the chance to maintain meaningful relationships, and he believes it's best to keep everyone at arm's length. If he stayed in that mentality, if he didn't ever try to reach out, then maybe his loneliness would have festered into something far nastier, just like Adachi. Soji, knowing all the horrible things that Adachi has done, also knows what it feels like to be alone, so he reaches out for him. In the game, the duality between the two is there, but it doesn't have the same impact without understanding more about the protagonist. He transferred to Inaba, and through that you can assume aspects of who he is and his perspective on relationships, but nothing of that is truly stated within the game. It's all up to interpretation. He is a silent protagonist that is meant for roleplay after all. The threads that connect the protagonist, Adachi, Nanako, and the entire message of the story, that people want to be understood and accepted, that people want a family to belong to, it's subtext at best. It doesn't have to be that way in the manga though, because it unearthed that subtext and brought it to the surface of the story, giving Persona 4 a stronger send-off to its ideas than even the game. As Soji leaves for home, the manga's conclusion sheds a new light on the meaning behind his departure. Rather than simply going home because his time in Inaba has run out, which almost feels pointlessly sad, he's taking what he learned and applying it to his future. All his experiences in Inaba can change his way of living. He's no longer afraid to make connections with other people, be it family or friends. He leaves with the intent to make a fresh start with his parents and to become a better family like the one he found in Inaba. Every exchange between him and Nanako, seeing the parental perspective through Dojima, making friendships that can reach past long distances, and even seeing what loneliness can lead someone to do, all these moments are what inspire him to take the final step aboard the train back home. That's a really touching way to conclude his story, and it's what sold me on the manga for Persona 4 being my favorite adaptation of a Persona game. Is the Persona 4 manga perfect? Does it have all the charms of the game? Can it replace the original? No, no, and no. This manga has its own faults, and it's still not the best entry point for a newcomer, who might not be totally won over. It's better as an addition to the ethos of Persona 4, rather than replacing the entire experience. As much as I like this manga and what it attempts to do, it could never beat out the full package of the game. Although it would be far more approachable than 3's manga, there's only so much that can be done when compressing a massive 80-hour game into 13 manga volumes. It still has some of the issues that were inherent to Persona 3's manga, such as the neglect of supporting characters, and I'm not sure how I feel about every change. The characters beating their own shadows with their personas is a little strange, I'll admit. And I have certain problems with the game that are unaddressed in the manga as well, but I don't want to linger on the problems of this manga. Regardless of its own faults, I think it should be celebrated that Sogabe so drastically improved his storytelling. He may have completely dropped the ball with his first adaptation, but his second attempt to make a Persona manga worked out significantly better. I welcome his attempts to readjust how the characters interact with the story and the little details he added to give the manga its own identity. If this is where he had to stop adapting Persona, then that's okay. He showed so much growth as a writer and artist during the 12 years that he worked on both adaptations. I haven't read Persona 5's manga yet, so I'm curious to see where the series goes under a new hand. Hopefully they start out better than Sogabe did and finish just as strongly. I'll find out eventually. For now, I just want to enjoy the fact that I actually came out of this manga not hating it.